Another topic that many of us are interested is in the relationship between psychological theories and cultural context. More generally, how do you view cultural differences in clinical practice? To put the question more specifically, one of the major criticism directed at mainstream psychology today is that many approaches are rooted in Western cultural assumptions. In your view, when it comes to conditions such as anxiety or panic disorder, do cultural differences become particularly important in the therapy room?
Yes, they do. Absolutely. It's very important. Uh, I think there are several important aspects to that question. Uh, One is that there are aspects of anxiety and panic and depression that are universal. We know from studies of populations around the world that depression is a universal kind of experience. A certain number of people in any culture become depressed, clinically depressed, that is, severely depressed. A certain number of people become anxious. A certain number of people have panic attacks. The panic attacks are fairly consistent. The percentage of people who have panic attacks, in other words, the prevalence of panic attacks, is fairly consistent around the world, but they're experienced very differently based on culture. Uh, so, for example, in Eastern cultures, Asian, uh, East Asian cultures, uh, China, Southeast Asia, Cambodia, uh, Thailand, um, there's this notion when somebody has a panic attack, it's interpreted in the context of yin and yang. Do you know yin and yang? Yeah, internal, external. And they often feel like they're choking. So they say, I'm choking because I'm overwhelmed by yin, or something like that. So there are these idioms, cultural idioms, that different groups use to describe what is a universal experience, and that is, say, a panic attack or anxiety. And so it's very important if you're treating somebody for you to be aware of these cultural idioms and how anxiety is, experienced and how it is expressed. There are also very different ways of coping with anxiety, depending again on the culture. Uh, and of course, that extends also to sex differences, males and females, experiencing anxiety very differently, coping with it very differently. Um, Males around the world are much less likely to report being anxious. Macho, trying to be a big man. They don't want to appear being frightened or anxious or panic attacks. So typically, in many places around the world, they will cope with it by alcohol, drinking alcohol or using substances to treat their anxiety. Less so in women. Women are more likely to, report anxiety. So the cultural difference, sexual differences in the way people experience and cope with anxiety. And very important for any therapist, to be well aware with that. And that's true throughout, all of mental health. So when I was in training, we had just to give you one example, and there are many examples, but when I was in training in the United States, we had a somebody also in training in psychiatry. And I think he, if I remember correctly, he was from Africa. And so a patient said to him one day, I feel like I have butterflies in my stomach. Now, do you know that it simply means your stomach feels, you feel nervous and, butterfly. Well, he took it literally and diagnosed the patient with paranoid delusions, that thinking that literally she thinks she has things in her stomach, and it was really just a cultural expression, just an idiom. And every culture has their own, idioms like that, their own ways of expressing internal feelings. So very important that we all know that. I'm sure in Turkey there are some expressions people would have that in the States would sound very strange to us. But we need to learn them if we were going to be therapists in Turkey.
Now I would like to move on the more contemporary topic. As you know, the spread of the psychological language on social media. Today, people on social media often describe themselves as traumatized, anxious, triggered. In your view, what are the main benefits or risks of the growing popularity of psychological concepts in everyday language?
That's a very good question, because I'm very concerned about it, and I think many people are. So you take the issue you mentioned of triggering. Well, triggering, it's a fairly new way to describe re-experiencing trauma. But when it was first originated, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it was supposed to be reserved for a cue, a conditioned stimulus, if you like, that resulted in re-experiencing the trauma that one may have experienced several years ago in its fullness, completely. So the typical example would be the combat veteran, the war veteran, who heard a car backfire, cars driving down the street in a city and it backfires. It's, a common thing, but it makes this big bang. And they'll, jump for cover, down behind a bush and cover their, they'll be re-experiencing the trauma of war. So that's what triggering initially meant. But now with social media, anytime somebody's uncomfortable, they say, I'm being triggered. And you need to do something, they might say, you need to do something about not triggering me. In the States, you can't watch a TV program these days or a newscast without the broadcaster saying, this next video clip may be very disturbing to some people. So, well, all that does is it makes the people want to see it more. So it's a good marketing tool. They get, people to glue their eyes to the television set to see what could be upsetting. But not to get people upset, not to get people triggered, not to do anything to trigger, just common, being concerned or upset. They're reinforcing avoidance. Society's reinforcing avoidance of any upsetting material. Well, as psychologists, we know that the only way you're going to develop some resilience, the only way you're going to develop some coping skills to deal with potentially upsetting things is by experiencing it fully and coping with it appropriately. not by avoiding it. If you're avoiding, just being upset, then as many people I think around the world are now doing, particularly in North America, then you're never going to learn, particularly if you're a teenager, you're a child and a teenager growing up, and you don't set and how to deal with frustration and various kinds of issues that come up, you're going to be very poorly equipped for adult life, because life can be very upsetting. Bad things happen. Your frustrations happen. You don't always get your way. And so I think this is a very good example, good question, a good example of society going overboard to try not to let anybody feel badly ever, to always protect them. And that, by the way, is one of the principal causes of anxiety. So we know developmentally that if you're raising children and you are what we call in North America a helicopter parent, do you have that analogy, that metaphor in Turkey? Yeah. So you're hovering over your child. You never want to let them fail. You never, you try to prevent them from experiencing anything upsetting. You clear the way for them. Well, these children never learn how to adequately cope with adversity. And so, and when you learn to cope with adversity, you then begin to develop a sense of control, a sense of agency, we call it, where you are capable of coping with adversity, with things that come along, and you develop some, coping skills. If you never get to do that, then by the time you're an adolescent or you're an adult, you do not have a sense of control. You have a sense that the world is a dangerous and uncontrollable place if you don't have your mother hovering over you. And that sense of control is at the heart of anxiety. You begin predicting that I'm not going to be able to deal with this, bad things are going to happen, and I won't be able to cope adequately with it. And then you begin worrying about the next bad thing that happens, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, yeah, I think the tendency to not let people get upset, to call everything that upsets them a trigger, is very dangerous for their psychological health.
Another topic I would like to discuss concerns the future, particularly in light of the artificial intelligence and increasing uncertainty. As I understand it, you have long described anxiety as being closely related to perceived uncontrollability. Today, the rapid development of artificial intelligence is creating new forms of uncertainty about the future for many people. What psychological skills do you think people will need to develop in order to cope with these modern and unpredictable threats?
Yes, I mean that's another threat, another danger. But it's part of being human that we're always going to be confronted with new challenges, new threats, new situations with which we have to cope. And it's not just artificial intelligence, it's technology in general. So, and this is true in every culture. We have our young people who have grown up with technology, which is now including some AI. and very comfortable with it. So there are many jokes, I think, certainly in our culture, about grandparents calling up their grandchildren and saying, come over here and fix my devices. Nothing works. And AI magnifies those concerns, or it can magnify them. Nobody knows. Even the developers of AI are saying they have concerns for the future. So it's very much an existential threat. And the question is going to be, how do we cope with it? Do we need to regulate it? Well, almost certainly we do, but nobody really knows how yet. And, in our country, there are meetings going on today I was in the news this morning, between the heads of some of the big AI companies, Anthropic and Google and some of these companies, and the government. And the government of the United States has decided to put export controls on some of the newest, most powerful AI programs. Well, that would damage the business that they're trying to put these export controls on. So there are meetings today. How can we deal? How can we avoid this? How can we, put on these regulations without, without damaging the business and without letting the business evolve in a way that's going to be, positive for humanity. So then that comes down to the individual. Not only dealing with the technology, but all of the threats it's posing to the technology. I don't know about Turkey or the West Asia, but one of the big threats going on in the States is this. They call it deep flaking. You know that term, deep flakes? It's basically using AI. Well, one example is some teenagers will use AI and choose a female in their school and create a picture of her with no clothes on. So, and it looks very realistic. It looks like this poor teenage girl has no clothes, and then they'll put it out on the internet. And, it's extraordinarily traumatizing. That's a real trauma. But nobody knows what to do about it. I mean, you could make it illegal and you can try to arrest the people who do it, but it's very hard to find out who did it. And there are so many things like that, coming up that are very, very anxiety provoking because you don't have control over it. But, on the other hand, that's life. Life it evolves, new things happen. There are wars, there are conflicts, there's new technology. And what's very important is that we all develop, as best we can, a strong sense of resilience, a strong sense that we can develop the coping skills we need to deal with anxiety, that we have the confidence in our coping skills, such that the next crisis that is in front of us, we don't run away from it. We can deal with it. Psychology, I think, can play a large role in this. Psychology can, particularly the developmental psychologist, can get into the school systems. The other, can advise society on parenting skills in order to provide children with the strongest set of kind of resilient behavior, with a enhanced confidence to deal with adversity when it comes at them. And if you know, to go back to the beginning, what I said in the beginning, if they don't do that, if they prevent them from ever confronting adversity, then you're almost guaranteed to have a very neurotic, anxious child.
Okay, related to that, would you like to share your thoughts on the potential benefits or risks of using artificial intelligence in clinical practice?
Well, that's a very interesting topic. Yeah, that's a very hot topic in North America. It's discussed all the time. You may have seen the examples. Well, let me say, first of all, as you know, I'm sure, that there are now companies that have developed to provide counseling, using AI. So you can go online and you can hook up with a, quotes, therapist who's actually an AI created. And they've discovered two things, at least two things, many more, but two main things. First of all, people relate to this AI. They develop what we call a therapeutic alliance. They become fond of the agent. We'll call it the AI agent, as if it were a person. So even if they know it isn't, even if they know it's not a person, which of course they do know it's not a person, they become very attached to their agent. And there are a number of people already who have been very troubled, and perhaps they've sought out therapy and it hasn't been successful, but they have established a connection with these agents, and then they get to the point where they need to talk with them every day. So that's one thing. So knowing that, that makes it right away potentially dangerous. Then number two, we have examples, which I'm sure you've read about and heard about, of agents giving very bad advice. We have had agents, patients say to their agent, life is not worth living to me. I would really feel like I would like to end my life. I'm just wondering, should I do it by hanging myself or by shooting? An AI agent will say, well, hanging is the better method because, So have you read some of those examples? Yeah. Well, they've actually told people how to kill themselves. So I have a student, former student, who was a very strong student. And after she finished with our program, she went to work at a big hospital in Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital, in psychiatry department. Did very well. And she was focused on suicide prevention. That was her field. But now, given this kind of a problem that has arisen, she has taken a new position with a large company, and that is providing AI-based care and digital care. They do have therapists there as well, but they're trying to, make therapy more available to a larger number of people. But her sole job is to seek out any dangerous answers that the agent might be giving. So they have to their clients or patients. So they have programs that kind of pick up every time these digital programs give some advice to a person that might be just a little bit dangerous. And they study that very carefully and plan on eliminating that kind of tendency from these digital programs. So, the problem is we're building these agentic AI supposedly to assist in disseminating and implementing therapy for a much larger number of people than we can do just by seeing everybody one-on-one. But we're learning as we go. It's not like these things are tested until we know they're totally safe, and then we say, here it is, and let's use it. It's being used, and they're testing it at the same time. So, there's going to be, I think, unfortunately, more tragedies about, very bad advice from AI. The same thing has happened with the epidemic of people who, particularly young people, isolated young people who get a hold of guns and go to the school and there's a shooting and maybe some people are killed. Often they're getting information on AI from AI agents, about ways to do this. So it's a very real problem, and you can't ban or eliminate AI agents. I mean, that's the idea is that they will be extraordinarily helpful as we develop these programs more thoroughly. But on the other hand, how do we deal with all these instances of misuse and very poor advice? Nobody has the full answer yet. I was just saying my own sort of perspective on things. So, I started my career in the 1960s. And so I have seen enormous changes in our field of psychology over the years. And overall, I think that, I'm very positive about the future. So when I began my career, there was no biological psychiatry. There were almost no drugs, except these major tranquilizers to sedate people with, who were flagrantly psychotic. And everybody practiced basically psychoanalysis, or at least psychoanalytically based psychotherapy. But there was no attempt to do research on it. There was no attempt to establish an evidence-based approach to psychology and to mental disorders, behavioral disorders in particular. There were examples in the past of people attempting to do research, but it was almost by accident. Nobody knew how to even begin to evaluate. So we had these, attempts at enormous studies where they would enroll hundreds or thousands of people. The independent variable, the treatment, would not be well defined. It would be very loose. The dependent variable, the measures, they would not be, particularly appropriate. And it was very loosely, so the trials ended up showing nothing. to the point where in 1970, the famous psychologist Carl Rogers, who did, client-centered therapy, said research has not contributed anything to what I do. Everything I've learned in therapy has just been by my own experience. So, and he was one of the principal, people advocating research up until that point. Then he gave up. He said, we just, it means nothing. Well, since then, look what's happened in the past 50 years. We've developed evidence-based treatments. We've learned how to do research. We've developed new treatments that are well-defined, that therapists, psychologists around the world can learn. And we've developed cultural adaptations of these treatments. We've proven through, developing good measures and good science that these treatments are effective. In other words, we have evidence for treating anxiety, panic disorder, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and a variety of other problems, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. We now, after really a fairly short time, my lifetime, my career, we have evidence-based treatments. Our big problem now is, and it's not to say they're perfect. There certainly is a lot of people who do not benefit from them. But we know that the large majority of people show very good results. So we need to do two things. First of all, we need to improve treatments more, both the psychological treatments and the drug treatments, and maybe sometimes their combination, although they don't always go together. We've learned that too. So just to make one comment on that, there are many drugs which, like the SSRIs, the antidepressant, anti-anxiety medications. There are many drugs that work for depression to some degree and for anxiety to some degree. And we have great psychological treatments. The advantage of the psychological treatments is that they are longer lasting, they're more durable. People seem to learn something, whereas there are higher rates of relapse from the drugs. So for years, people thought, well, if we combine the drug with the psychological treatment, we'll get even better results. But what happens is the drugs seem to interfere in many cases, particularly anxiety disorders, with these psychological treatments, because part of the effective mechanism of psychological treatments is that you have to make people anxious so we can teach them how to cope with it and how to deal with it. And the drugs don't let that happen. So we've learned that people, if you're doing a studies where you have a psychological treatment, a drug treatment, then the combination does worse often. So they don't always go together. So there's a lot we're learning from research. But we are developing evidence-based treatments. We have now some reasonably good ones. So that's one thing. But the bigger problem is making them available to the people who need them. In other words, disseminating and implementing these treatments. That's a larger problem. And our public health authorities, are involved. We're experimenting with all the digital applications. And so that's where the focus of a lot of research is now. A big area of study in North America and also Western Europe now is called global mental health. So in other words, can we take our treatments that seem to be effective in North America and adapt them culturally so they're also effective in Central Africa? or in Iraq. There's some programs going on in Iraq right now. Or in, more third world countries, underdeveloped countries. And there's very few psychologists or psychiatrists in those countries. So can we adapt these treatments such that the local healers, or maybe, every tribes often have healers, a person designated as, can we train these, healers to deliver these treatments? So the whole focus on implementation and dissemination is, a very, very large topic right now. And so but overall, I'm very optimistic. We now have evidence-based treatments where when I started, we didn't. We're focusing very hard on dissemination and implementation, a lot more work on that. We need to deal with challenges that come along, like AI, and how can we best use it, maybe to aid, dissemination. So all in all, I think we're on the right track, and waiting for the next generation of people like Ahmet to pick up the ball and carry on.
We now have DSM-V, and maybe in 5 or 6 years later, DSM-VI will appear. Do you think we will see major changes, especially in anxiety disorder, in DSM-VI categorizing? For example, we see in DSM-V in personal disorder, alternative model of personal disorder. In ICD, the categorical diagnosis of personal disorder totally no longer in ICD classification. Do you think we see major changes like this in DSM-VI, especially for anxiety disorder?
Well, that's a very good question.
Thank you.
There are committees that are already formed working on DSM-VI, and we're participating in some of them. And they're looking at various aspects of it. They haven't actually started revising the criteria yet, but I think there's a target date of maybe 2030, so maybe about 3 or 4 years when DSM-VI, they're hoping DSM-VI will come out. I was very much involved in DSM-IV and to some extent DSM-V. I won't be involved in DSM-VI, obviously. But we've been working very closely with the World Health Organization to try and make the ICD and the DSM, as close as possible based on the science. So you asked about both the anxiety disorders and the personality disorders. For the anxiety disorders, I don't foresee major changes. There'll be some fine tuning, just as there was in DSM-V. We separated out the obsessive compulsive disorders and, created agoraphobia as a separate disorder. So, there was a few changes like that, but the disorders themselves did not change much. But the personality disorders, that's where the big changes are happening. As you know, we've always known. I've been on the DSM committee since the 1980s. I was. And we knew then that the categorical personality disorders were very poorly defined and did not reflect really reality in a good way. We knew we needed something more dimensional, something where we could talk about the traits and on a dimensional way. But nobody could agree on what it was, on how to do it. Well, now you've seen in DSM-V and DSM-V TR that we have the people studying personality had proposed new dimensional sort of descriptions of personality disorders based on the big five, what we call the big five traits. And they thought, the people on the committee, they thought, this is good, we're ready to go. But when it got to the Council of the American Psychiatric Association that has to have final approval of all these things, they turned it down. So it became, in the appendix, as you know, it became a proposal. So it was still, it's still at the proposal stage, pending further study. Well, I think for DSM-6, it was just about ready to go in DSM-5, but it didn't make it. I think in DSM-6, that's where we'll see the big change. I think we will go to finally adopt a more dimensional approach. And an ICD, the ICD, I think will arrive at the same conclusion. Because we often work together. We often have joint committees, the ICD and the DSM.
Okay.
So very interesting. Yeah.
What is your message to young clinicians and researchers just entering the field?
Well, again, I think it's a great time to enter the field. I'm very optimistic, and I think that we need to advance our science in our research to make our treatments, our psychological treatments, even better. We need the largest number of people. And I think for people, I'm a little biased, but I think people who want to be psychologists are some of the best people in the world because they really want to help people and they want to work on these big problems. And so I just wish them the best in their continued studies, as I do you. To do certain things. And if we don't do them, our brain, our limbic system says, well, I need to try harder to get this person to do this thing. So if you've ever, something I use, an example I use with many of my patients is the following. If you find yourself in a place where something strikes you funny, it's unintended, but somebody does something that strikes you funny, but you're in a place where you cannot laugh out loud, it'd be very embarrassing. Maybe it's a wedding or a religious ceremony or something where last thing you want to do is laugh out loud. Well, you attempt to suppress that humor, that laughter. And nothing has ever been more funny than if you're trying to, it becomes harder and harder to suppress that emotional reaction to express a little, laughter or joy. Well, it's the same thing with anxiety. The more you attempt to squash the anxiety, the more you attempt to avoid it or suppress it, the stronger it becomes. Most emotional phenomenon. It's also true for emotionally laden thoughts or cognitions. And that is that if you have a anxious thought or cognition and you attempt to suppress it, it's going to come back at double the strength. So the one thing patients can't do is avoid their emotions. We need to teach them how to cope with their emotions.
It has been a genuinely privilege to speak with you, David. We are deeply grateful for your contribution to this conversation. Thank you again. We wish you continued success in your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you, and best of luck.